name is Russell Kelley. I'm the Vice President of the Alliance Française Miami Metro. And I am coming from you today from Paris. And I'm delighted on behalf of the Alliance Française Miami Metro, our President, Patricia Bonin, and our Director, Stanislas Riner, to welcome Vincent Floreani, who kindly consented to participate in this rendezvous today. Vincent Floreani was appointed the Consul General of France in Miami on February 1st of this year. And before coming to Miami, Vincent Floreani has served as Consul General in 2 other cities in the United States. Chicago in 2014, no, one other city in the United States. So this is your second stop in the US. But immediately before coming here, you were Consul General of France in Hô Chi Minh City in Vietnam. And before that, earlier in your career, you served abroad in Romania, Indonesia, Kenya, Uganda, New York, and Abu Dhabi, which is quite an extraordinary variety of destinations. I'm happy to see that I'm now looking at the chat session, and I see that people are here. And can you see something? No. Okay. Okay. Can people see us? If you're here, if you can see us, please send me or send us in the chat line at the bottom of your screen. I can. Okay. Someone says I can. That's good. We can see you. Excellent. Great. See, hear, wonderful. Everybody but you, Françoise. Okay. Okay. Excellent. So we will carry on then. And Vincent Floreani is also a graduate of the prestigious École Nationale d'Administration, which is quite well known in France. Among other things, the president of France and a number of his predecessors are also graduates of the École Nationale d'Administration. But I am, and anybody who graduates from that school is known as an énarque. So we are flattered to have an énarque with us today, but I'm not sure what you will be called tomorrow because the name of the school has changed. So it is now the Institut de Service Public. So you will be an ISPUT or something. We'll work on that. You'll always be an énarque. So Vincent has kindly accepted our invitation to talk to us today about the election process in France and to explain how it differs from the election process in the United States, which is a very interesting subject because many of us use the same words when describing our election process and institutions, but they have very different meanings in French and English. And so we will try to clarify those meanings. And of course, this is a timely discussion because it's almost exactly 1 month since Emmanuel Macron was elected to his second term as president of France. And it's about 3 weeks before the legislative election begins with its first round on June 12th. Just to, on a technical, before we start talking with Vincent Floreani, Monsieur le Consul, just to remind you that this is a webinar format. It took us a while to get it organized, but it's a webinar format, which means that you unfortunately can only see Vincent Floreani and Russell Kelley on the screen. You don't know who else is out there, but you can, however, as people have done, communicate with each other by using the chat line as you have done. And please say hello from wherever you are. I see there are people from Palm Beach from tuning in, which is good, and Jupiter Island and other exotic locales, Montana, that's great. Fort Lauderdale, Tennessee, Nashville, thank you, Philadelphia, hello Faith, and other exotic locales. But when it comes to asking questions, and please pose your questions not in the chat line, but in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, because I'll be looking at that for questions. And when you ask questions, please keep in mind that in his role as Consul General, Vincent Floreani is strictly neutral in political matters. And so while he can explain the process with great precision, he cannot express any political opinions in his comments today. So by way, that's kind of by way of kicking it off. So thank you once again, Vincent, for joining us today. And would you, just as a very preliminary matter, describe to us, because it's going to come up throughout the talk, how the three branches of what the three branches of the French government are?
Well, there is the executive branch, there is the legislative branch, and the judiciary. So this, I mean, I guess is what you mean. Yeah. So what in France we elect?
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. In France we elect.
So we.
Please go ahead. Yeah.
So what we will do, we will not talk about the judicial branch, but we will talk about the executive branch and the legislative branch, because they sound similar. You have a president, we have a president. You have a cabinet. We have a cabinet that's different from your cabinet, but we'll talk about those things. So let us please begin by talking about the executive branch, the president, and then we will get to the legislative branch. So to kick things off, we just literally finished a month ago the presidential election, but could we go back in time a little bit, and would you please explain to us how the French president is elected?
Mm-hmm. So thank you. Again, I should have started by that, but thank you very much for hosting me. It's a pleasure to be part of this webinar, and I'm a great supporter of Alliance Française, and I would like to thank everybody who are helping Alliance Française develop all over the US and the world. So the French president is elected directly by the people of France. So this is a major difference with the US. It's also different from the UK and Germany, where the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, who are the head of the executive branch, are elected by the Parliament. Before 1962, the French president was also elected by the Parliament, but General de Gaulle wanted a change to reinforce the separation of power, and also to bring more legitimacy to the president. So since 1962, the French presidents have been elected by the people of France directly in a direct vote. Who votes? French citizens over the age of 18. The first time they vote, however, they need to go to the city council and register. They need to do that one time. And the schedule of the presidential election, if I may add, the presidential election is organized between 20 and 35 days before the end of the incumbent president's mandate. To be elected, the candidate needs to obtain more than 50% of the votes. This never happens. Only General de Gaulle got about 35% of the votes in 1965. But now, like this year, with 12 candidates, it's not possible to reach that level. And President Macron obtained, I think, 28% of the vote in the first round. So there's always a second round, and this year it was for the second time between President Macron and Marine Le Pen, and President Macron got 58.5% of the vote, and Marine Le Pen the rest, 41.5%.
And what was the abstention rate?
It was high for France. Usually in French presidential elections, the turnout is about 85% sometimes. This year it was only around 70%, 72%. So the abstention was 28, which is high for France. It would be low for other countries, but in France, usually presidential elections enjoy a large, strong turnout. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so you, in America, the election always falls on the first Tuesday in November. And it's very easy. You gave a range, 5 to 20 days before the end of the term. It's kind of an unusual formulation for us. Who determines what exact dates the election will take place?
I think it's the Council of Ministers, the minister, the president with his Council of Ministers that set the dates. Of course, everything, the whole election is under supervision of the Constitutional Council, Conseil Constitutionnel, that makes sure that the Constitution is respected, that the whatever is decided abide by the Constitution. Another thing you mentioned, Tuesday in the US, in France, elections are always on Sundays. That probably help to have a greater turnout.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And while thinking about it, I mean, this is of course, your system, because you will no doubt mention that the president can dissolve parliament at any time. And that means that the parliament will not be necessarily a full 5 years. You never know when it'll end. So I guess you can never fix the date for the election until you know when the parliament will end. Okay, so that kind of explains it. And you drew a very important distinction between France, the French president, and the British prime minister, and the German chancellor, which is their equivalent of a prime minister, both of whom represent their majority parties or alliances of parties in the case of Germany. But in France, and this is something that's unusual for sure, you've got both. You've got a president and a prime minister. Yes. And that is unique. At least I'm not familiar with a country that has a president and a prime minister. So yes.
Yeah, in Germany or Israel, they have a president, but the president in Germany or Israel is mostly ceremonial or keeper of certain principles. In France, they are both leaders of the executive power, but the president, we have something that is referred to as a presidential system or semi-presidential system. So the president is very strong in France. It would be the equivalent of the prime minister in the UK or the chancellor in Germany, but with even more power. And the prime minister is the head, is the first among ministers.
But in Israel, and I guess there are many other countries with presidents, Italy, Germany, they can't appoint the prime minister.
No,
they have a separate role, as you say, ceremonial role.
Yeah, why, it was this constitution that we have in France was a decision of de Gaulle. He wanted to have a strong president because of the what happened before, in the decades before, with a parliamentary system, with very unstable system, and the inability to take decisions when needed. We were in times of crisis, decolonization, the war, and it was very difficult to take decision. And he wanted a system with a strong president, a democratic system, but with a strong president.
This is the Fifth Republic. So this is the fifth version of having a democratic government. And I remember reading the Fourth Republic, which started in 1945 after World War II and went up to 1958. So, 13 years. Do you recall how many governments there were in that 13-year period?
I don't recall, but they were changing often. They were, sometimes less than a year. It was very unstable, but I don't recall the exact number of governments.
Right.
Do you know, Rizal?
It's over a dozen. I mean,
Yeah.
it was remarkable, the number, which of course is what drove de Gaulle, I guess, to say, I'll be president, but not in this system.
Yeah.
We have to have a more stable system, for sure. So the president appoints a prime minister, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But still getting on the presidential side, one of the things that, of course, impresses us Americans about the French election, and there are many things that impress us about it, is the number of candidates that ran for presidency. I think there were 12.
Yes, this year, yeah.
Is that typical?
Yes. As far as I can remember, I've always seen many candidates for the president, for the first one of the presidential elections. This year we had 2 Trotskyists, 1 communist, 1 socialist, 1 green, 2 on the extreme right,
Yeah, it's quite a range. So can just anybody run for president, or how do you become eligible?
Yes, so it's not easy. You need to be 18 years old. You need to gather. You need 18 years old, registered voter, and other personal condition. But you need to register 500 signatures from elected officials, and the signatures must come from 30 French districts, 30 départements, as we call them, to ensure, this signature, they are there to ensure that the candidate has enough recognition, first, and secondly, that it represents all parts of France and not only a region. So having these signatures from 30 départements ensure that the signatures come from all parts of France. There are 100 departments in France.
I cite 2 examples, and perhaps you can, which is that Marine Le Pen, who you said, as you pointed out, came in second in the first round and the second round. But anyway, she got more votes than anybody except Macron. She did not get 500 signatures all by herself, did she? Yes,
you're right. What changed since last presidential election is now the signatures are public. The Conseil Constitutionnel make them public, so people know who is supporting Marine Le Pen, who is supporting Éric Zemmour. And people, she's from the far right, so people are reluctant to appear as supporting her. Mm-hmm. So she was about to miss that threshold of 500 signatures. And one politician from the center right said, it's not possible. She represents a large force in France. If she cannot run for the presidential election, it would be a democratic mistake. So he helped collect signatures from people saying, I will sign for Marine Le Pen. I don't support her, but I will sign. I will bring my signature to her because I think she should be able to run for president.
That is quite remarkable, yes. I have to say, that as a democratic gesture. And that was François Bayrou of the Mouvement Démocratique, I suppose.
Yeah.
Okay. And there were others who didn't make it, like Madame Taubira.
Yes.
Who was at least as credible a candidate as some of the others that you mentioned, by their parties, or that's my own.
Yeah, I cannot comment.
You cannot comment. Okay, and so, but among the parties that did have candidates, there were the big ones.
Yes.
Like the Socialist Party, like Les Républicains, And how did they determine who would represent their parties? We in the United States are used to an agonizing year or half year of primaries in every state in the union, or most of them, or caucuses. Do you have to go through that painful process?
No, primaries are very rare in France. They happen twice, if my memory is good. In 2007, the Socialist Party organized a primary, and it went well. And in 2012, in 2012, the Socialist Party organized primaries, and in 2017, it was the Les Républicains center-right organized primaries as well. I'm not sure it's going to gain momentum in France. Why? Because what we have noticed is that the primaries in France, the way they have happened, tend to bring divisions inside each party and tend to favor candidates that are a bit more radical. And to get elected in France, you need to be in the center. So if you elect, if your candidate is a bit more radical, too much on the left, too much on the right, it's difficult for that person to be elected. So I'm not sure it will work in France, or so far the experience is not so good.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting observation, and of course it has worked the same way in the United States. Typically, in order to appeal to one of our two parties or another, you have to appeal to a fairly hardcore part of the party, which doesn't necessarily work in the general election. There have, however, been recent exceptions to that rule 5 years ago, for example. Another thing that is very different in the US and France that I'd like to explore is how you actually physically vote. You French citizens physically vote, because in the United States, you are now in Florida, and you have been up to Palm Beach County. And Palm Beach County is the home of the hanging Chad. I don't know if you know that expression. Well, it's when George Bush was running against Gore.
Yes.
And they voted with a machine, and the machine was supposed to punch little holes in a card, a computer card, and some of the holes didn't come through all the way. And so there was a little bit of paper that was hanging, which is called a hanging Chad. Okay. So anyway, so we vote with machines, we vote absentee with mailing in and everything. How do you vote?
Yeah, so our system is very simple. One election, each election has its own date, and you can vote only in person, or if you're unable to come to the voting station, you can vote by proxy if you are ill, if you're abroad. And it's easy. And I brought some the papers that we use to vote. So for the I don't know whether you can see them.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. The papers with the names of the candidates are displayed on the table in the voting station. So the voter comes, he or she must pick at least 2 papers to ensure secrecy of the vote. He or she sets into an envelope. They go to the voting booth here. And when they
have a voting booth.
Yeah, we put that for you.
A prop. Very good. Bravo.
And when they are inside, behind the curtain, they put one piece of paper with the candidate of their choice in the envelope, and then they put the envelope in the transparent ballot box. I brought one here also for you. So they put the envelope.
Very good.
Yeah. Of course, we control the name of the voter if the name is registered in this polling station. And after voting, the voter must sign, and at the end, we make sure that we have the same number of envelopes and signatures. So there's no one, brought 200 envelopes in the, more. So we make that. And then at the end, we open at the end of the day, at the end of the voting time, we open the ballot box, and volunteers can't open the envelopes, and they count one by one the papers. And the other people, counting the numbers. It's under supervision of political parties. So it's very simple, very transparent. Everything is transparent, not only the voting box.
Right.
And then we send the result to the Ministry of the Interior that make the addition of the votes. And this is how it works. It's very quick, very yeah.
Okay, well, thank you for bringing in those helpful, the ballot box, the ballots themselves. That's very low tech, but very simple.
Yeah.
People keep it simple. That's got to be helpful. Now,
no hacking.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So since we do have a few French citizens resident abroad who are on this call or this webinar, please explain how French citizens resident abroad can go about voting.
Well, it's the same. They register at the consulate, and then we organize polling stations. In Florida, we had 6 of them, 3 in Miami, then West Palm Beach that you mentioned, Orlando, and Tampa. And we also cover some islands. So we had 2 other polling stations in the Bahamas and Puerto Rico. So the same, they come to the consulate, for example, and they have these names, they take them, exactly like in France. And at the end of the day, we send the results to Paris. The only difference is that we vote one day ahead of France. So we vote on Saturday. So our votes are included earlier in the vote. And when we vote, we don't know the result, because the result is immediate. In France, if at 8 o'clock, the day of the vote, of the election, who is the winner. But here, 8 o'clock is 2 in the afternoon, and we continue to vote. And, if you already know who is elected, it's not, it doesn't work.
So the volunteers are counting the votes all during the day. They
Yes.
don't wait until 8 o'clock.
No. The election is on Saturday here, so they vote. The election stops at 7 o'clock, and the volunteers from 7 o'clock they start counting the names, and we send on Saturday evening. We send to Paris.
And in Paris, do they count throughout Sunday?
No. In France, some in the rural areas, they stop at 6 o'clock, or small towns. And in Paris and big cities, it's 8 o'clock. But the pollsters, according to what they see from 6 o'clock in the rural areas and towns, they're able to tell with a very strong accuracy who is the winner.
Okay, all right. That's very interesting. It's very low tech, and you don't have the same. And the other thing that you mentioned that I would emphasize is that you have 2 pieces of paper,
or 12,
or Macron.
Yeah,
and you're only voting for one office, the president, and so you have. And for example, in the legislative election, which will be, we'll talk about in a minute, June 12th, first round, will everybody just vote for one deputy? Everybody who goes in?
Yes. Yes. For the legislative elections, we have 577 deputies, so close to 600. There are 577 elections in each. There are districts, what we call them circonscriptions, and in each of them, it's an election, different from the one next door.
Right. Okay. So there are a couple of subjects that I know we want to get to because they're distinguish the American. We will talk about, for example, the term of the French election. The French presidential term is now 5 years, down from 7. And we'll talk about that in a minute, which is an interesting phenomenon because it now is the same term as the deputies.
Yeah.
And
I would like to add something because you're talking about the difference, Russell. So if I may, there are two differences I would like to highlight. One is a huge difference is the limitation of spending. There's a strict limitation of spending in France to avoid corruption, to avoid conflict of interest. In France, the cap of spending is low. For the first round is 17 million euros. And for those who qualified for the second round, it's 20 million. So, it's very low, 22.5 million. It's very low, while in the US, Biden and Trump, the total money they raised was $6.6 billion. So in France, 22 million is almost nothing. And the donation are limited also. Companies cannot donate, and private citizen only can donate money, but it's limited to 4,700 euros every year. So there's also a cap on the amount of money private citizen can give. It's to avoid, corruption or elected officials being, depending on people who give them a lot of money. So that's one major difference. Another one is equal airtime. So when we are close to the election, there is what we call equitable airtime for each candidate. It should be more or less similar. As we are getting closer to the election, 2 weeks before the election, it must be completely equal between candidates. All candidates must receive exactly the same number of minutes of airtime. So it's controlled by a French agency. So limitation of spending, equal airtime. I think airtime is two major difference with the US system.
Those are two huge differences with the US system, because yes, you mentioned how much Trump and Biden spent on their campaign. I mean, there might have been a third candidate, there probably was, but believe me, he didn't get nearly as much money, so there is very little parity. But on that important subject of financing, it was much in the press that in the first round of the presidential election, the representative of what used to be one of the two main parties of France, Les Républicains, got 4.78% vote. Her 5 years earlier, Fillon got 20%. So that was, number one, a huge drop in the number of votes for the Les Républicains candidate. And it was below the magic number of 5%. Would you please explain the significance of the magic number of 5%?
Yes. So you are right. This year, the two main political parties that have dominated the political life of France since World War II collapsed. The Socialist Party was under 2%, and the Les Républicains, the center-right, was under 5%. And it's important because candidates can get a refund, can get money, public money, to pay for their expenses if they reach 5%. So if they reach 5%, they are entitled to 8 million euros in compensation for their spending. If they are below that, they only get 800,000 euros. So probably Valérie Pécresse, Les Républicains, I think she spent 5 million euros, and she got only 800,000 from the government. So it's complicated. When you are under 5%, you may lose money if you.
Yeah, and it's just while we're on the subject of 5%, there were only 4 candidates that got more than, out of the 12, who got more than 5%.
Yes.
And one of those barely got more than, got 7%.
Exactly.
So it's also a pretty important control. So that keeps the number of frivolous candidates down, some in addition to the 500 signatures. That's another reason, if, unless you have a very deep pocket.
Exactly.
But if you're an individual, can you spend as much money as you want? Your own money?
I mean, yes, you can spend, I mean, up to the 22 million, I mean, up to the ceiling of spending, you can spend your own money, right? Sometimes you need to borrow. And that happened to Marine Le Pen. She borrowed from a Russian bank, 10 million. So in 2017, there was a decision that it was not possible to borrow from a bank outside the EU. So she borrowed from a bank in Hungary.
Yes.
Yeah.
That was an interesting point raised in the debate between the 2 finalists in the second round, and it has had some repercussions on the campaign materials, I believe, for the Rassemblement National. So I think we're going to have to shift subjects here, but you know, one thing that was also dramatic and much talked about is that it took Emmanuel Macron, having won the presidency, it took him a month or 3 weeks to appoint a new prime minister.
Yes.
Then took another 4 days to get a government or ministers. Are there any rules about when you have to appoint a new government after you've been elected president?
Well, you remember that the elections took place 20 to 35 days before the end of his mandate. So, you know, it took about 2-3 weeks for his mandate to hard, and then rapidly it chose a prime minister and the government. So it was within, you know, it was consistent with the law, and no problem into that. It made his opponents a bit nervous because they wanted to start, you know, criticizing the new government. So it gave them less time to do that.
That's true. So and it's often, would you say that it's accurate to say that the campaign for the legislative election actually begins with the appointment of the new cabinet, or the new government?
Not exactly, because, you know, the candidate who arrived third in the presidential elections started immediately the day of the elections. He said, now we are, you know, I will become the prime minister. I'm the campaign for the legislative election is starting, you know, so it depends. So Jean-Luc Mélenchon, on the day of the result of the presidential elections, started his campaign for the legislative election the very day. So you can decide, but it's easier to, you know, because basically many campaigns are built on the criticizing the ruling party, the government. So it's easier when you have a government to start your campaign.
So I'm going to jump ahead here a little bit, because we talk about the legislative election. When we think of legislature in the United States, we think of the Congress, the House of Representatives, and the Senate. But your legislative election is only for the National Assembly. It's not for the Senate, n'est-ce pas?
Yes, exactement. We vote directly for the members of the National Assembly, the 577. For the senators, it's an indirect elections. They are elected by what we call grands électeurs. They are mostly council members of communes, they are members of local governments. There are 126,000 people that elect the 348 senators. So I'm not an elected official. I don't vote for senators, for example.
Uh-huh. Is it this, are the grands électeurs the same people who signed the 500 signatures for?
More or less, yes. More or
More or
less, yes. Yeah,
Okay.
about the same person, yeah.
Okay, so we have again, it's a 2-round election for these 577 deputies. But there's been much discussion. We're not going to have presumably 12 representatives from the same 12 parties who ran for president running in each of these 577 circumscriptions. And there seems to be a lot of maneuvering between the left and the right to form. Would you please explain this whole concept of a confederation?
Yes. So to make sure they are elected, they form coalition. The political parties form coalitions. So there are 3 blocks now in France. There is a bloc around the French President Emmanuel Macron. It's called Ensemble. And it's a gathering mostly, I would say, of center-left, center-right parties, center and center-right parties. There is a bloc far-right with Marine Le Pen. She's alone. And there's a bloc far-left around Jean-Luc Mélenchon with center-left parties or extreme left, because they are the communists there. So I would say center-left, extreme or far-left parties. Yeah. So 3 blocks, and they will present candidates with the names of their union. You know, Ensemble for the Macron union, NUPES for around Jean-Luc Mélenchon. So they have more chance to have their candidates elected when they are together.
So each one of these confederations will select a single candidate to represent them in most of the circumscriptions.
Exactly. But there are candidates that disagree with that. You know, like the Socialist Party joined the union with Jean-Luc Mélenchon. But so they will be, they might not be selected to be candidates, so they can run individually.
Oh,
You know,
I see.
so it's complicated. You might have, you know, I think in our circumscription here in the North America, we will have 12 candidates.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
There's
So,
one circumscription for the United States. One deputy represents the Frenchman in the United States?
United States and Canada, it's circumscription number 1. It depends on the number of French people abroad, registered abroad. So there are many of them in the US and Canada, so 1 circumscription. There's another circumscription, number 4, for example, what we call Benelux, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands. It's 1 circumscription because there are many, many French people. But in Asia, there are not so many. So there's a very huge circumscription, number 11, that is made of Eastern Europe, most of Asia, and Oceania. So it can be, yeah, it can be large, very small, or very large.
Okay. And and who is running, do you know, for the first circumscription or the 4th circumscription in the United States and Canada? What the representatives are?
We receive, I mean, most French parties will be represented. The incumbent is running, and we just received the 12 names, I was told, but I didn't see them. Yeah.
I see. Okay. And so it's in the United States, as you know, when that first Tuesday in November, we elect not only the president, but also the Congress, all of the Congress members, 500 and so number of congressmen, and 1/3 of the senators. So there's a lot of voting going on in that office behind you, that polling booth behind you. But you do it separately.
Yeah.
Which, so it's 7 weeks after the presidential election this year, there will be the first round of the legislative election. Why do you hold these elections at different dates?
So in France, each office is an election. We don't mix, I show you the papers, things are simple, easy to understand for the citizens. The election of the president is the most visible, the most important political event for French voters. And I mentioned the turnout is usually around 80%, sometimes over 80%. If we had at the same day the legislative elections, that will bring some confusion. We want to keep things simple. So that's why we separate both elections. So there's something that happens. Usually, the legislative elections are after the presidential elections, and the party that wins the presidential elections usually wins the legislative elections because its voters are motivated. They are, they're enthusiastic. So they are mobilized and they vote. And conversely, the other parties usually do not win in the legislative election.
But they have in the past.
So that have happened, but not immediately after the presidential election. So let me explain. It's what we call cohabitation, when the president must share power with a prime minister from another party, from an opposing party. When we had a mandate for the president that was 7 years, after 5 years, there was the election of the new parliament. And twice, the other party won when it was President Mitterrand. So in 1986, the Socialist Party lost the legislative election, and the prime minister that Mitterrand was forced to select was Jacques Chirac. In 1993, again, the second 7-year term of President Mitterrand, he lost again the presidential, legislative election, and he was forced to choose a prime minister from the center right, and it was Édouard Balladur. It happened a third time when President Chirac was elected. He decided in 1997 to dissolve the National Assembly, and he lost the subsequent election, and he had to designate a prime minister from the Socialist Party. It was Lionel Jospin. So it happened. Why? Because if he doesn't choose a prime minister from the opposing party, the National Assembly can vote no confidence of the prime minister, and the prime minister would be forced to quit. So he has to choose a prime minister of the same majority as in that exists in the National Assembly.
As a practical matter,
yes.
If he didn't, the government would be voted out.
Exactly. So there's no choice. There's no choice.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So that's a very good point. Justifying why there are 5-year terms for both the president and the parliament now, or the National Assembly now. And indeed, since that's been the case, there has not been an example of cohabitation, but we'll see about what happens this year. I'm very interested to see, would you explain to us, there are two terms that we hear from time to time that are confusing to some of us. And I don't know if it comes up so much in the context of the legislative elections, but oftentimes you put forward a party or puts forward a list of candidates. Does that apply for the legislative election, or is that a different election, for example, or regional? I'm unfamiliar with the list.
Yeah. Okay.
Concept.
So the list apply for local elections, so municipalities, department, region. Let's say there's a town with 20 council members. The political parties will come forward with a list of 20 candidates. If they get 50% of the votes, the top 10 candidates will be elected. So this is the concept of the list. Russell, if you allow me, and I'm sure that can interest the people listening to us, is another major difference between France and the US. It's what we call parité, so equal representation of women and men. It started, it's to make sure that women are represented enough in politics in France as elected people. It started in 2000 with several laws that increase the pressure to have more women represented as elected officials. And there was even in 2008 an amendment to the French Constitution that said that the law shall promote equal access by women and men to elective offices and posts. And at the legislative elections, if the parties do not have enough women, if the balance between men and women candidates is not 50-50, they can have financial sanctions. The money that they receive from the government to finance political parties will be reduced because it takes into account gender equality. It's the same, you mentioned the list. For local elections, when the political parties come with the list must alternate men and women to make sure there will be about the same number of women. And that works well because we have now in France about 40% of women in the National Assembly, 40%, and probably next month will be close to 50%. We are not we are among the top 4 in Europe in the number of women in parliament. We can do better. We can reach 50%, but it gave good results. I think in the US, in the House of Representatives, 28% of women.
Okay, well,
so parity, yeah, it's a strong thing in France. And now we have a woman prime minister for the second time in the Fifth Republic.
When did this rule of parité come into force?
It started in the year 2000 with several laws, gradually increasing the number, the pressure, not only the pressure, the law, the regulation to have more women.
Okay. I have 3 more questions. We'll have to wrap it up then. One of the things that we hear about, again, in France a lot is something called a cumuldemonda. That you can hold many different offices. And that is a rule that keeps changing too, doesn't it? And would you explain what the idea behind the rule is and what the rule is?
Yeah, so the number of mandates one person can hold is limited for 2 reasons. One, to ensure diversity among elected officials, and second, for members of parliament to ensure that they focus on their parliamentary work. For example, a député, a member of the National Assembly, cannot be a minister, cannot be a senator, cannot be a senior civil servant like a prefect or a magistrate or an officer. So there is this limitation. Yeah, it exists in France and it has increased as well.
And there's another term that we hear a lot in Europe that we never hear in the United States. So would you please enlighten us and define the idea of proportional representation? And first of all, is it present? I think it's present in some elections in France, but not others.
Yes.
So it's a fairly complicated subject for Americans to understand.
Yeah, so basically, proportional representation means that you have in an elected body about the same number of elected officials as the number of votes. So it applies, for example, in the regional elections in France. There's a part that is proportional. It does not apply to the legislative elections, to the National Assembly. And sometimes it is seen as not fair. Let's take the Front National or Rassemblement National of Marine Le Pen. She obtained in twice, you know, she was qualified for a second round twice. She obtained 30 or 40% of the votes, but she has only 7 deputies out of 577. So some people say it's not fair, and there have been discussion to have more proportional, or more deputies elected in the proportional way. The thing is, the French system is designed to ensure stability. You know, we're referring to the Fourth Republic with 24 government in 12 years. We don't want that. So we have to find the right balance between fairness and stability. Now it's a majority system in each of the 577 circumscription. It's the first one that is elected.
Yeah. Well, that is the system that we're familiar with. Winner takes all, as
Yes.
they say. But your example is pretty dramatic when Marine Le Pen's party wins. Last 5 years ago, it was 33% of the vote, which would be 175 representatives or something like that out of 577, and she only got 7. Her party's only got 7. That's a very dramatic illustration of the impact of proportional representation. So just one final question. So there are 2 rounds in the legislative election, just like there are in the presidential election. But in the legislative election, it's not the top 2 finishers in the second round.
No.
Pourquoi pas, and what is the rule?
So, I mean, it's possible in the legislative elections that to be elected in the first round. It happens in a few of the 577 elections, that some of them, it happens, some of them, not many people elected in the first round. We want to ensure there are enough people in the second round. So, we want to ensure that most people can be represented. So the threshold is 12.5%. So among the candidates in the first round, those who reach 12.5% qualify for the second round. You can have in some places 3 candidates, even 4, in the second round. And the one who wins is not the one with over 50%, but the ones with the most vote. Because if you have 4 candidates, maybe nobody will have 50% of the vote.
Right.
So I guess why we do that, probably to have more diversity among the deputies, I guess, rather than the 2, traditional parties, maybe to ensure more diversity.
Yeah. It's interesting that you use a different system for presidential and legislative. So we have 3 weeks to go to round 1 of the legislative elections. It's obviously very important for the current government. And by the way, one other thing to clarify, when you say government, when the French say government, the government, what do you mean?
The ministers. We mean the ministers.
The ministers.
Yeah. Each minister has an administration, like the Minister of Foreign Affairs has the Quai d'Orsay to work for him or her, because she's a woman now. But when we call government, these are the ministers and the prime minister.
Okay. And because in America, we would refer to that as the cabinet.
Mhm.
But your word for cabinet means a minister's office or the president's office, his cabinet, n'est-ce pas?
Oui, exactly. The
The
private
word
office,
cabinet, un cabinet d'un
ministerial.
ministre.
Yeah, it's a private office. So each minister.
Anyway, it's a faux
has-
ami.
Yeah.
That you can.
There's a cut. On est coupé là, non? Moi, je suis pas coupé. D'accord. Ah, il est coupé, Russell, ouais. Russell, you were cut off. You, Mike?
Okay, here we go.
Yeah.
I think we're going to bring it to a halt there. It's obviously very important to see what will happen in the legislative elections because if the Ensemble, the group supporting Macron's party, which I think is now called Renaissance, n'est-ce pas? La République en marche, reborn. He will be able to achieve his legislative agenda, hopefully, and otherwise it's going to be cohabitation and blockage. And that has dramatic implications, not only for France, but for Europe and the larger world. So we will be watching with keen interest. Thank you so much, Vincent, for generously giving us your time and explaining this system to us so clearly. We have a much better understanding of it.
Russell, maybe you want to take one or two questions from the participants if they are.
I do have. Okay, I have one that I didn't ask because I was not clear whether you would.
Yeah, I can take 10 more minutes if you need.
Okay, so an astute political observer points out that groups of the extreme left in the presidential election and the extreme right got over 60% of the vote in the first round of the election. Macron got 28%, Le Pen got 23%, and Mélenchon got 21%. And then if you add the Trotskyists and so on that you mentioned earlier, the left got 60% of the vote, which is quite dramatic. So the question put is the following. Does that mean that when the French vote in the first round with their heart, they really want out of the euro, the EU, and be friends with Putin?
No, not necessarily. I mean, I'm not sure that any candidate, any of the major candidates explicitly advocate leaving the EU, what we call a Frexit. I'm not sure. I mean, Marine Le Pen in the previous elections was sort of saying that she might leave the euro, the money, the common.
Yeah.
It didn't work for her. So I think today no candidate explicitly say we are going to. You know, my party is asking for Frexit, French leaving the EU. No, on the contrary, I mean. President Macron was very firm in his support to Europe, and he got more than 58% of the votes. And Marine Le Pen was not saying that she would leave Europe, the European Union.
No, that is certainly true. She definitely backed off from that. That was her position, I think, 5 years ago. But she moderated the position and it took a backseat to her economic arguments. This election would be my observation, but it was still in the background. But as you say, it was not explicit.
Maybe one candidate, Dupont-Aignan, is for Frexit, but you know, I don't know how many votes he got, but around
What-
1%. Yeah.
What is his party? Can you remind me?
Il s'appelle Nicolas Dupont-Aignan.
Yeah,
Nicolas Dupont-Aignan. Yeah, I think it's the only one.
Debout la France.
Yeah, Debout la France. Yeah, Debout la France. Yeah,
I love the title, the names.
yeah.
There-
I mean, I cannot say.
I know,
Sorry.
I know. No.
So I didn't say remove.
Yeah,
There,
we could.
but all of the, I mean, there are some great names here that we're just use boring Republicans and Democrats, and you've got much more
Yes.
poetry involved in your names.
But there are cute animals associated with the parties in the US.
That is true. We have our cute animals, and don't ask me to explain. I can't remember why we chose donkeys and elephants. It makes, perhaps someone in the audience can clarify us on that one. Bon, I think that will have to do it, Vincent. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup.
It was great. Thank you for your patience, everyone out there. For those who hung around, we appreciate it. For your support to the Alliance Française Miami Metro and your interest in French politics, which is a fascinating subject, as is most of French matters. Okay, merci beaucoup et au revoir.
Merci beaucoup, Russell. Merci à tous. You know, people are learning French. They are supporting the Alliance. So I understand they like French. They like to know more about French politics. So thank you for your time and your interest in the subject.
It's great. Merci.
Merci.
Bye.